Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Talking all things Russia, Ukraine, geopol, security, military intel. As usual, you're here with me. I'm Ryan. Spent 8 years at the Army, 8 years at CIA. As always, we're joined with Glenn Korn, 3 decades in USG, much of that with CIA, a lot of that covering Russia, true expert on this topic, and in fact is calling in from Ukraine. So without further ado, Glenn, what are you doing over there, and what's it like right now?
Hey, it's great to see you, Ryan, and hello to all of your fans and the followers.
Our fans,
yeah.
yeah.
Our fans. I like it. Looks like you're in a cozy place there. That's nice.
I am. Yes.
I'm not going to name where I am, but I am, yes, in Ukraine right now, and we're here with the visit that we've been here about 2 weeks. We have another couple of weeks to go, and traveling a lot, talking to a lot of people. For various reasons, which I won't go into all of them, but mainly is to show the Ukrainians that we are still very interested, trying to make sure we understand their perspective on things, and relay to them that there are many, many Americans who are supportive of their cause to defend their sovereignty.
All right. Well, you're on the ground. Where should we start, you think? Like, what do you think people should be hearing about that maybe they're seeing in the news, or maybe they're not seeing in the news, that you might see firsthand where you're at now?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Ukrainians are following very closely developments. One at the Munich Security Conference, and of course now talks in Saudi Arabia between the Russia and U.S. Mixed reaction from people. I think mainly many Ukrainians are concerned that the U.S. is going to cut some kind of deal without their voice or participation. And then there's, there are a lot of different statements coming out of the new administration, some contradictory, some which are welcome, some not welcome. But I would say that many of the Ukrainians we speak with, they want peace. They want this war to end. They're willing to make compromises. They want to make sure they're forced to make compromises because they know that Putin will have maximalist demands of them, which they don't want to have to, they've given a lot of blood to protect their country, and they don't want to give up too much territory. They definitely don't want to give up their sovereignty, or some of the things Putin has been saying is, pretty much he has to decide who's running Ukraine, and they're not going to go for that.
Yeah.
And by the way, I should also say the president's proposal, like to, agree on mineral rights or access to some of the natural resources here in return for our aid. Many Ukrainians support that. They're not against it. They actually like the idea. So I think that was a good idea that the president had.
Okay. And you mentioned the Munich Security Conference. Obviously, a lot of news that came out of that with state heads talking. Zelensky made the rounds, chatting with all kinds of folks trying to get additional support. And then you mentioned Saudi. So Witkoff, who's the presidential envoy heading there, I think also national security advisor for a bilat with the Russians. You've also got folks from Ukraine who will be there. It seems like it's the right place for people to have a discussion. I think maybe Lavrov might be going from Russia. Do you think that that is where some of the sausage is going to be made on this deal?
Well, it's not clear, Ryan. There are conflicting reports on whether the Ukrainians are going to be included in this. President Zelensky said yesterday publicly that Ukrainians were not sending a delegation. What is not clear to me is that, if it's a bilateral between the U.S. and Russia, then in my opinion, that's absolutely appropriate. Ukraine may come up, but I personally do not think that we should make a decision on the future of Ukraine without the Ukrainians at the table and having a lot, direct input and direct say. I think what I read is that General Kellogg and I believe Marco Rubio both said that these discussions are not going to include any final agreement on what happens in Ukraine, but they are going to be a test on seeing how serious Putin is really about trying to find a peaceful solution and his willingness to make compromises to achieve that peace.
How about there's some news that's come out recently about this new intel organization within the Russian security services, the SSD, the Directorate for Special Tasks. Not sure if you've heard of this. It's kind of like the FSB has merged some of its capabilities with GRU, specifically, I think it's Unit 29155, which many people have assessed was behind some of the poisonings that happened a few years ago, bringing them together for both tactical covert efforts and then more direct work in Western Europe. Has that come up at all with what you've seen, Glenn, or is this a surprise to you at all? This is a Wall Street Journal report from this week.
History of using political assassinations, covert action operations, or what some people call wet operations. They believe it's a legitimate way of waging war. And I'm not surprised. I think people in the West are beginning to wake up to this, just like it took them a long time in the U.S. and in Europe to wake up to the covert influence operations that the Russians run. And so not surprised at all. In terms of the folks here on the ground, the Ukrainians have also demonstrated they have a very capable intelligence community that is doing some counter operations, which have been very successful. And of course, everybody here is, they just arrested the Internal Security Service here. The SBU just arrested a senior officer who was in charge of counterintelligence, who was working for the FSB. So he was a penetration of the SBU. And of course, that's a reminder that you always have to, be on your P's and Q's. And I think the Ukrainians are pretty professional, but they're also dealing with a very difficult situation, given the kind of common history and the way the Russians have tried to influence and infiltrate the society for many years. Hundreds of years, actually. So, yeah.
Then I think probably need to just discuss what's going on with talks with the new administration, NATO allies, and kind of the peace deal coming up. But just from where you sit now, Glenn, if they were to kind of go forward with peace talks with Russia, with Ukraine, and you had suggested this when we talked months ago, but can you get an idea of what territory would be ceded or not, both directions at this point in time with Russia and Ukraine?
Right. So you have like the Donbass, you have areas that are occupied by the Russians, parts of Zaporozhye, Kherson. Of course, the Ukrainians have parts of Kursk Oblast, so the Kursk province. And I think there have been some suggestions that the Ukrainians are willing to trade Russian territory for some Ukrainian territory. Of course, the Russians have occupied Crimea. So, my understanding is part of the negotiations will be, okay, what is Putin going to give up, be made to give up and liberate for the Ukrainians? What are the Ukrainians going to be willing to accept in terms of lost temporarily? I don't think the Ukrainians are ever going to accept, for example, that they're giving up Crimea. Legally, it is part of the Ukrainian state. And, my view personally is we should look at this as maybe we did like the Germanys after the Second World War. We never accepted, or the Baltics, by the way, that they were not independent countries. And eventually they got their independence back. But the Ukrainians are willing to make some compromises. They just need to see that the Russians are also going to make acceptable compromises for Kiev.
Do you think there's a chance in 3 months that this war is done?
I think there's a chance. I think that, what everyone's waiting to see now is how we're going to put pressure on Putin to make sure that there is a just peace, how the Europeans are going to participate. I think the administration is asking the Europeans to put troops on the ground here because after any peaceful settlement or ceasefire, the Ukrainians are well aware that the Russians are going to try again in the future to reinvade, to reinstigate a war. And that's the history. Just ask the Chechens going back to the 90s. And so the Ukrainians are looking for some guarantees for their peace and for their security. And the Europeans are being asked to consider put people on the ground. I think the British came out yesterday and said they would put troops on the ground. And my understanding is that, Munich, the vice president made a very controversial speech at the security conference. I think I encourage all your listeners to read the entire speech because only snippets are being put out in the media. And I think that's dangerous because people have their own agendas. There's a lot in that speech that I personally agree with. And I think one of the things this administration is saying is the Europeans need to step up and do more for collective defense, increase their defense budgets, and that the U.S. has, a lot of priorities to deal with. And one thing I would tell your listeners too is, I think I've said this in the past, we've been ignoring the Western Hemisphere for years, and the administration is now putting a lot of emphasis on the Western Hemisphere because we've lost a lot of influence in Central America and South America. The Chinese have gained a lot of influence. The Iranians gained influence. The Russians have gained influence. And that shouldn't be acceptable to us because that is our backyard. And so we need help from the Europeans managing all this. I think the administration is looking for that. And the administration is willing to be kind of blunt in a way that maybe other administrations have not been willing to be. That's shocking a lot of people in Europe, but hopefully it will also energize them to understand, we want to have a transatlantic partnership, and it's got to be a partnership.
We heard that in the first Trump administration too, right? I mean, the push for additional defense spending up to 4% of GDP, something like that, but it didn't seem to take hold. And they really are coming out stronger earlier now, it seems.
I mean, that's a great point. And after Trump left office, some of the European leaders, I remember the Albanian prime minister publicly stating that Trump was right and it was good that he was pushing the Europeans to do more. I heard recently in a meeting in Washington, this is maybe 3 weeks ago, that the Europeans at the next NATO summit will be ready to hit 3%, which would be an improvement. It's probably not what President Trump wants, but it's a forward movement. And maybe they'll do more. But some of our NATO allies are not carrying their weight. Now, they do a lot of other things that are important to mention, and they can be very good allies. But some are just not carrying their weight, and the American people are not going to carry the weight for them forever. And I think that's kind of the message from this administration. We want to be partners, but it's got to be equal partnership. And then from the European perspective, I think that this administration will have to accept that we don't get the final say on everything. If everybody's carrying their weight, sometimes the Europeans get to make the call. The Turks get to make the call. I always use Turkey as an example because the Turks are doing a lot of stuff. You just look at Syria, where they kind of engineered the removal of Bashar al-Assad or took advantage of the opportunity to do that. And they should get, in my opinion, thumbs up for that, right? We didn't have to do that. They did. So some people don't like that in Washington, but I think we have to come around to understanding that if, we want to be partners, sometimes other partners get the final say.
We'll link out to Vance's speech here in the description so people can read the full notes to your point. Can we talk prisoner swaps real quick, Glenn? So we saw Fogel, the American, getting traded, looks like, for Alexander Vinnick, who's kind of a Bitcoin cyber type character. They got traded a week or two ago. I think Rubio came out and said that had nothing to do with the war necessarily. But how do you view that type of exchange? How do you think listeners should be thinking about that?
Well, we had a number of exchanges during the Biden administration. It's good that Mr. Fogel is home. God bless him and his family. He was in custody for too long. Like other trades, they're very controversial because, people will argue that, we got a teacher back. The Russians got a cyber criminal who stole a lot of money from a lot of people. That was some of the criticisms of some of the Biden era trades. You could look at it different ways, but I think it was a sign from the Russians that I think they want to have a dialogue. Of course, they're going to want to control the narrative of the dialogue, and I hope this administration does not let them do that, because we should remind the Russians we are in a position of strength. The trade, at the end of the day, I think is probably a good thing because there's another American home, but we also have to be concerned that this encourages the Russians to grab other people or other countries to grab people to try and achieve political objectives. So again, that goes back to the Biden era trades as well. I just have to be very careful about that.
To that point, I think Putin invited Trump over for their May Day parade later this year. If you were in the administration, how would you advise on that?
I would personally suggest against it because I don't think Putin has earned the right to have the American president come to Russia to attend that celebration. I don't think that it's something that is really good for the United States or the international community. And I also don't think that the U.S. president should go to Russia first. If there was any kind of meeting, I would make the Russian president come to us. But of course, the administration and President Trump may have their own views. And, I just hope that Putin is not seen as being rewarded for everything that he's caused a lot of death and damage in a country that didn't deserve it. There was no excuse for what the Russians have done here. None.
And just to your point on like a position of strength, and it would seem that wouldn't be the best approach there. How about North Koreans? So we saw maybe 2 months back that North Korea was sending 10 to 11,000 troops over. We saw them reported in some of the frontline engagements not doing so well. Then they kind of went away to some degree. Like there wasn't a lot said about them. And then they've resurfaced with some reports of them back on the front lines wearing Russian uniforms, carrying Russian IDs. There's been discussion of injured Russian soldiers being treated back in North Korea, Russian orphans being in North Korea. What do you make of that at this point, Glenn, with the North Koreans here?
Yeah, so I don't think they're making the big difference that maybe the Russians were hoping they were going to make. My understanding is that they are not treated well by the Russian commanders. They are not integrating well into the Russian units. The Russians seem to be desperate. If I were Russian, I'd be embarrassed to have to turn to North Korea for this kind of help. The Ukrainians, my understanding is that the Russian advances are slowing and that the Ukrainians are still making some advances in Kursk. The Ukrainians are adapting well. They have their challenges, especially manpower wise. And of course, it would be great if the South Koreans would do more to help Ukraine right now. But again, if I were Russian, I'd really ask, like, why are we having to turn to a country like North Korea to fight a war for us? That tells you something.
And I think they've reported, at least the press has been reporting, they've lost at least 1,000 killed, the North Koreans, and maybe 2,000 to 3,000 more wounded out of 10 to 11,000 that are there.
Right.
Anything else Russia-Ukraine related before question on the agency itself, Clint?
No, I would just say, I keep telling people there's a lot of like churn about statements that are coming out from different people in the administration. And what I always tell people is judge the administration by its actions, not by its words. The words are portrayed in the media. You need to be very careful about listening to people's analysis instead of what's being said. And I'm telling that to the Ukrainians because I'm still very, very hopeful that this administration is going to stand by them and is going to be very clear to Vladimir Putin that what Putin is doing is not acceptable, and we're not going to stand by and let it happen. I don't want a war with Russia, but I also don't think that we should allow the Russians to bully their neighbors or us or our European allies.
Could you see any chance Russia would actually go against a NATO ally, as Zelensky might be suggesting?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's always a danger that Russia will attack a NATO country. I think the Baltic states are the most vulnerable, most concerned, maybe Poland, because they have long histories with the Russians. And some people say that if we back down in Ukraine, that will fuel Putin's willingness to go further. You could debate that point, but I don't even think we should test that. We as Americans should make sure that the Ukrainians have what they need to defend their country, because I do believe that it is helping us in the long run, the United States, for many reasons. I'll say this: we had a meeting with the mayor of Kiev, who was a world champion boxer, and he was talking. He has a brother, and when we left that meeting, I told the American and the Australian I was with, friends of mine that were with me. I said, "Okay, can you imagine having to go to war with these guys? God help us, right?" Brian,
he's a giant, isn't he?
Yeah, you're a soldier, and I'm like, if that guy was in the other trench with his brother, I would not be. And here's the thing: we don't want those guys going back east.
No.
Right? We need them on our side, and I hope that the president and his team know that. They are very, very capable people, and people are responding positively to it. They want more American involvement here.
Glenn, thanks for the time. I know you're running up against another meeting that's probably far more important than this one. I hope you stay safe. And can't wait to see you on the other side here.
Hey, can I just say one thing while I'm talking to you?
Please.
So I put in the background here. This is a picture of a wall I took in one of the Ukrainian cities, and you can see there's a soldier and his wife or his girlfriend, and it's written in Ukrainian, "I will wait for you. I will wait for you forever. I am here for you. I will never forget you. And I'm waiting for your return." And for listeners, they should know that there are about 1 million Ukrainians on the front and that means 1 million families, or, estimate, who are without their loved ones day in and day out and facing the risk that they'll never come home. And for those of us who were in positions like that before, we know how taxing that can be and how important it is to have people at home that love you and that you have something to live up to or live, strive to survive.
Yeah.
And I hope the American people, your listeners, are sympathetic to that, because it's just terrible that people have to be like this. It'd be much better if they could just be with their loved ones and live their lives. And the Ukrainian people did not start this war.
Well said. Thanks, Glenn. You stay safe.
Okay.
We'll see you on this
Thanks,
side.
Ryan. Okay, ciao.
Just a quick word from our sponsor, NordVPN, and we'll get right back. As many of you know, my background in the Army and USG makes me a bit paranoid when it comes to my online profile. I've been doxxed by some unfriendly groups, and we really don't want to give adversaries anything they can use against me. This is why I use NordVPN. For me, I use NordVPN when I'm looking at more sensitive data online, like banking and financial information, and when sharing tax-related info. I also use NordVPN on my phone or laptop when I'm traveling, at a hotel, a coffee shop, on public Wi-Fi, to keep prying eyes off my business. What's great is that NordVPN has the fastest VPN in the world, so you don't get the buffering and other challenges when you need it, and it's got threat protection features that keep you safe. Lastly, I've used NordVPN to get access to shows and information that I otherwise would not have been able to, including for my kids when we were abroad. To get the best discount off your NordVPN plan, go to nordvpn.com/combatstory. Our link will also give you 4 extra months on the 2-year plan. There's no risk with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. The link is in the podcast episode description box.